thinking back to when I was at UCLA, there were these two old ladies, and by old I just mean like they were like in their late 50s. So most of us were obviously early 20s, they were in their late 50s, and they were pursuing degrees in philosophy. And those are undergraduate degrees, so they're pursuing their bachelor's. When should they have finished their bachelor's degrees? Longer than that even, yeah. Early 20s, 30 years, 35 years earlier. But they didn't. And it was neat actually because they had each other, and so they took all the same classes, they were there working through the program together. They were very friendly. They talked to all of us, we interacted with them. There wasn't this thing of just kind of like, oh, they're too old, or they didn't look at us like, oh, they're too young. Again, they had husbands, they had families. What happened was they had children, and their children grew up, went to school, left home, and so they had that empty nest syndrome, where they had no kids at home, their husbands were at work all day, so they decided to go to school. And that was it. And they decided to go ahead and get a degree. I don't know, I remember asking them at the time what they planned to do with the degree, and they just said, we don't know yet. We don't know yet. They just wanted to learn, and they wanted to get as much out of that learning process as they could. And they did end up finishing, I think they were like a year behind me, but I believe I remember seeing something posted that they did finish, and that's neat. I have no idea what they did after that. With a degree in philosophy, you can go to like law school or something like that. Maybe they did that. Maybe they were just happy with the fact that they finished their philosophy degree. I don't know. But I remember that I thought it was odd that nobody gave them any grief about being so old and being undergraduates. And I don't even mean like in front of them, but when they were away, there was never this sense among us like, why are they too old? There's never any of that. Everyone in my at least my group thought it was really neat that they were doing this together. And they had each other to do that. Maybe it would have been a lot harder if they were doing it by themselves. And so maybe that was the best time, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 35 years ago. But they didn't. So I guess you have a choice at that point. Do you want to finish life without ever having done the thing that you wanted to do? Or would you rather finish it and be older then? Last period somebody brought up a thing about becoming an engineer, like finishing high school, going to college and become an engineer, and versus somebody who maybe didn't finish high school, and then they get into their late 30s and they decide they want to become an engineer. What can you do? I guess you can do your GED, you can then go to college, become an engineer. You've lost the opportunity to be a young engineer. That's never going to happen now. But what you can do is still be an engineer. It's about expectations, managing your expectations. One thing I know is that if you're over 35 years old, you're not going to play in the NBA. You're not going to be a 36-year-old rookie. That's just not going to happen. Well, it's possible. I guess according to the laws of physics, it's possible, but it's never going to happen. So you have to give up the idea at certain points. The problem is that we give up on things too early, too quickly. We oftentimes think like, I'm just too old, I couldn't do this, or I couldn't do that, or I've missed my opportunity. Like I talk with students now, and I try really hard not to, how do I say it? I talk to students now who are like, 18 years old. I talk to my students over at the college who are like, 21 years old. And it amazes me how often I'll hear them talk about how it's too late to do something. And it's like, you're 20 years old. I mean, it's too late to do something. Well, they wanted to start, like one person I'm thinking of particularly was telling me recently that they wanted to learn how to play the violin, but they're 20 years old. She's 21, I know, she's 20 or 21 years old now. And she was just saying, yeah, but I mean, everybody else who plays the violin, they start when they're like kids. It's too old for me now. And I was saying, maybe it's too old to play in the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and by the way, maybe it's not. Maybe you pick up the violin and you're just a prodigy. You're just incredible at it and you get good really fast. Maybe. But if your goal is to play it in the Philharmonic, you probably did miss your window to be able to do that. But that's the question. Do you want to become a violinist, or do you want to become a violinist who plays in the Philharmonic? The earlier you start with things, the better, of course. But think about what it is that you're giving up in that process. If right now you're thinking like, oh, I want to play the piano, whatever, then I might be too old to play the piano. I wish I had started 5 years ago. Well, think about what you did 5 years ago instead of play the piano. And maybe what you were doing instead was more worth your while. Or maybe even the thing that you were doing maybe would make you a better pianist today. In other words, you're older now, but that also means that you're more mature. That means that you have more focus. It means that you have a greater sense of vision and purpose, so maybe you're going to be more dedicated to that thing. I think back to when I started reading philosophy. I was like 12 years old, 12, 13 years old. I remember getting kicked out of my math class for telling my math teacher, whose name I still remember, strangely enough. Well, it's a hard name to forget. Her name was Miss Reddick. You can imagine how much fun 7th grade boys had with that name. And she kicked me out of class because I was sitting there like all brooding one day. And she comes over and she's like, "Stephen, what's wrong? Why are you brooding?" And I just told her that God was dead. And that we had killed him, and it was our greatest accomplishment. So I got sent to the principal's office. I didn't understand what I was reading at 12 or 13 years old. So people might be like, "Well, of course you can do this because you've been doing it since you were 12 years old." I didn't understand it at 12. If you had started reading that stuff at 18 years old, you definitely would have gotten way more out of it than I would have at 12 years old. So yeah, I've been doing it longer, but the first several years is a wash, probably, because you don't understand what's going on. When you're older and you pick it up, your mind is more focused. You can grow way more from it. And of course, a 12-year-old, hopefully. So maybe you start playing guitar when you were 15, but you're just kind of messing around. You're not really learning. And then when you're 18, you have more of a sense of urgency. I had to learn this thing now because I'm so many years behind. And your mind is ready. You're prepared now to learn more theory, to learn more structure. And maybe you're better off at it. Who knows? You start getting 20 years down the road, same thing. By the way, those women that were taking those philosophy courses, they had straight B's. A's are very difficult to get in philosophy, especially at the higher levels. But they had straight B's, so they were doing pretty well. Would they have done better when they were in their early 20s, 35 years earlier? Maybe not. I know that when I teach undergraduates, there's a real difference if I teach morning classes or if I teach evening classes. Morning classes are full of students who are like 18, 19, 20 years old. When I teach evening classes, it's full of people who are like in their mid-20s. Even it's just a few years difference, man, or like late 20s. And a lot of them are military. And so they come in and their thing is, what do I have to do to get an A in this class? Here's the syllabus, do these things here, and you'll get an A in the class. And they realize, okay, thank you, sir. And then they do they just go down the list and they do what they're supposed to do. That's a skill set that they probably learned from being in the military. If they had just popped in my class at 18 years old or 19 years old, they probably wouldn't have had the same focus. And so even though they're a few years older, they're a few years way better, just from maturity. So sometimes you have to have that space and that gap because you're not prepared for it. Hopefully you're prepared for it when you're younger and you'll do better with it. But if you didn't do it 20 years ago, maybe today. Maybe today's the best time to do it. If you planted that tree 20 years ago, you'd have fruit today. Okay. But if you don't plant it today, 20 years from now, you're going to be sitting there saying, I should have done this 20 years ago. Of course, 40 years ago would have been better. 20 years ago would have been would have been great. But today, oh well, it's too late now. And then you're going to be 60 years old, looking back on that from when you were 40 and saying, man, I really should have done this when I was 40. So, the best time to do something is now, of course. Next best time is now. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques? Easy one for today.